Welcome to our roundtable, Dispossession and Structural Transformations of Property. For this final panel, we're joined by Jacob Blumenfeld, Regina Kreide, and Robert Nichols. Thank you all for joining us the past few days of discussion. In this final session, we're going to continue the dialogue about capitalism, modern property, dispossession, and expropriation in neoliberal times. During the next hour or so, I'll be proposing different topics and starting off the dialogues with each of our commentators. You'll have 3 or 4 minutes to talk, please, because we have to go to the airport, and then we'll continue to the next one. So, I will be guiding the dialogue. So first, I want to ask you, Jacob, in your research, what relationship did you find between the consolidation of capitalism, colonialism, and the mediation of dispossession between these two historical and structural phenomena?
Just like the massive question. Okay, 3 minutes to answer the $1 million question. Okay, I'll say there's 2 ways of thinking about this, at least, that are opposed to each other on the surface. On the one hand, according to figures like Brenna Bandar, modern property relations were born in the colony, right? They were imposed by law on indigenous communities, on inhabitants in territories, and they were imposed on the colony because there was no feudal landlords to resist them, to fight back. Right? They just use force to impose this title by registration, abstract property law, private rights, in the way that Robert also tells the story of ascription, but through transfer. And eventually, this form of property is brought back to the metropole later and reshaping Europe and the United States. That's one story that's kind of told about the relation between colonialism, property, and capitalism. On the other hand, there's a story of, let's say, according to Robert Brenner, in which modern capitalist property relations begin in the English countryside in the 17th century. Right? So nothing to do with the colonies. The colonies is a separate project. Modern capitalist property relations is an economic relation, economic practice, not a legal relation, in which peasants, tenants, and landlords adapt depending on their different class relations. They adapt methods of production. They develop new forms of labor-saving technology. They become dependent on the market for their own survival. And these are specifically capitalist property relations, right, that did not exist before in feudalism. In this story, capitalist property is a practice that starts in the English countryside, slowly enveloping the world. So these are 2 opposite stories, right, at least on the surface. I think one way to see them, one way to fix this puzzle is to say, well, the colonial story is really a story about law. It's a story about the imposition of a particular kind of law and the fixation and the development of property law in the world. The story about property as economic practice, economic relation, is a story of practices, of practices and production that is not necessarily legalized yet, right? Becomes formulated in law, perhaps with the return of the colonial property regime to the center. So I would say that's one way of telling the story about the relation between the 2. And I think it's always good to have in mind both, to not forget the specificity of capitalism in England, and also not to forget the centrality of the colonial property law outside.
Thank you. Do I have the same question to answer the same question?
The question will be, how do you understand the figure of expropriation? Do you think this figure exceeds the dispossession phenomena?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Expropriation is linked to the idea of property. And in my view, and Jacob said already a lot, I can follow up here. In my view, property has always to do with freedom and unfreedom, not to be free, in a dialectical way. So it's a relational conception, like you said also in sociology, one can talk about relational conceptions. So it's always linked to its opposite. It's the freedom for some, and through posing power, domination, and you all said exclusion, it's unfreedom for others. And I always see it in this dialectical term. It's unfreedom at the same time. So expropriation also is linked to appropriatization of something. So it's also linked in that way. Just another thing, we haven't talked yet about a sociological conception of property, like with Bourdieu. And so we very much talked about economic property, but we shouldn't forget about social and cultural capital. We raised it at some point. But especially cultural capital has something to do with dominating others because of educational title, because of knowing something better about the epistemic domination. That's also part of property and, in a way, dispossession. So domination, like with Gramsci, in a cultural way.
Thank you, Regina. Well, Robert already answered my question in his talk, so I think I will think another question. The question will be: you in your word you say the dispossession mediates between capitalism and colonialism. How is this mediation possible?
Thank you. I would say, so I start initially by thinking with Marx. And Marx uses the word dispossession in capital. In German, he uses Enteignung, but also expropriation. So we have these two different terms. One's Latinate and the other's German. But Marx says, in the process of developing a capitalist society, what happens is an original separation process, ein Scheidungsprozess. And this separates immediate producers from direct access to the means of production. So he's thinking of simple farmers who have direct access to food because they grow it themselves. They're immediate producers, not mediated, right? They have direct access to the things they need to reproduce their society. They can appropriate wood from the forests to make firewood for their homes. They can pick fruit and they can glean grain. So what has to happen before capitalism can get started is people, immediate producers, need to be separated from direct access to the means of production and subsistence. And so he sometimes uses the word expropriation or dispossession to refer to that separation process. But Marx is mostly interested in, so one question is, why is that wrong, or what's problematic about that? And anarchist thinkers, classical anarchist thinkers, said the problem with that is it's like a theft. It's like stealing what is properly these people, belongs to these people. It's an original case of theft. So it's a violation of their rights as property owners. And in that sense is retrospectively oriented because it's about what they were before the process. But I think Marx rightly says that that's a mistaken way of formulating it. And he says the problem with expropriation or dispossession as this separation process is not so much that it violates my anterior rights, but that it pushes me into a new situation. So the problem with expropriation is not that it is a theft of my original possession, but that it is exploitation enabling. Because once I don't have direct access to the means of production and subsistence, I then have to sell myself in order to get wages, to get capital, to purchase the things that I used to be able to make myself. So Marx thinks that expropriation and dispossession are important parts of capitalist development, but he tends to think about it as teleologically oriented towards the production of proletarianized people, It's just the first step to proletarianization. So he thinks of exploitation as he thinks of expropriation as exploitation enabling. I think that there is something very important about that, the forward orientation of it. What does it do? But I think Marx does not think about the fact that it is not the case that in all contexts, people are dispossessed in order to proletarianize them. There is such a thing as dispossession without proletarianization. And that can happen when the context is such that there's already an excess of cheap labor coming from somewhere else. Then, in the context I'm thinking of, I'm from Canada, so I'm more familiar with the empirical context of Canada and other English-speaking settler colonies. Indigenous people are dispossessed of their land, severed from direct access to the means of subsistence and production, but not in order to proletarianize them. It's not to drive them into factory work. Why? Because because colonizers already have an excess of cheap labor, which they are importing from somewhere else in the form of enslavement and also the indentured workers of Europe. So the excess of labor in the Anglo-settler context renders indigenous people highly vulnerable to a form of dispossession without proletarianization, because they're not even needed for exploitation as workers. And that's what explains why you can commit horrible forms of genocide against these populations, because you don't even need them as a workforce. So you get a phenomenon like dispossession without proletarianization. Now that's still capitalist, but it doesn't obey the sort of strict original logic that Marx was focused on, in which dispossession is explainable primarily in terms of its production of exploitation. And that's the thing that I'm trying to think about, is that different configuration.
Thank you, Robert. Now I'll talk about some topics about that, the topic of dispossession in Peru. I have one idea about this process of dispossession, historical process of dispossession in Peru. I think in Peru there is a dialectical movement of dispossession that has different expressions, mechanisms, and normative frameworks, depending on the historical moment we fixate upon. But I think a key characteristic of the movement is the form of the colonial experience of domination in Peru. For example, in colonial Peru, the decision was made to exploit indigenous labor rather than exterminate them. For example, the United States made that decision, also Argentina in La Pampa. And to achieve this, dispossession policies were implemented by the colonial apparatus, where there were made population reductions and relocation of indigenous groups. Also, I think this movement and ambivalence persists in the Republic because there was this ambivalence in the relation between state and indigenous population. The state promoted haciendas under private property rights, the regime of private property, but also promote indigenous protection under the farmers' communities. For example, with Leguía in 1920. So this was a kind of form of patronizing and oppressive inclusion to the state, to the nation state, right? So I want to make a parenthesis here about the image of the hacienda. No? The hacienda here is an image of, it's a form of property, private property, that overlaps with the particular history of coloniality in Peru. For example, in the figure of the Yanacona also, that is a kind of servant, but also worker, but none of them also. No, and that person has this position because their ethno-racial characteristics and because their role in the territorial dispossession processes they played on, and also because of their labor power. So I'm thinking, like Robert, this is still capitalism, the haciendas, the form that dispossession takes in Peru, but in a particular way, and this particular way is está pintado, I can say it in English, with the formal the colonial experience of domination in Peru. So I think we have to like research this experience of dispossession in situated frameworks and situated experiences. So yeah. The next topic. Sorry. Okay. If you want.
I just had just a question for you. I mean, so for Maratigi, he says, what the colonial experience in Peru didn't bring capitalism, right? It brought feudalism in a sense. And the abolition of the colonial domination didn't bring capitalism either, right? It left the feudal property structures intact. And I'm just wondering how do you find that analysis also helpful to use these categories of feudalism and the feudal property structure to help explain like haciendas and the longevity of this kind of form of property?
I think that was an error of the Orthodox Marxist reading of the hacienda. Yeah, and I don't think I think Mariatti is right to characterize the hacienda like a semi-feudal relation of domination exploitation, but I think he still makes the point that it's still served for capital accumulation. Yeah, so I think it's a capitalist a la peruana, right? Yeah, a capitalism a la peruana, right? Yeah.
I would like to follow up briefly also your intervention and maybe also address the audience here, since you mentioned also the Peruvian case. One can talk about, and some do, like Nancy Fraser's and some others, other German sociologists, they talk about re-feudalization right now. And what they mean by that is that there is a kind of concentration of ownership, be it land or housing or in the financial sector, so shares in the companies. And this kind of massive accumulation of ownership titles happens without any control of the people whatsoever. And this is kind of re-feudalization. And I think this is a good description, at least, of what is going on right now. And the question, I'm more familiar with Colombia, is also why these big haciendas or fincas are still in place. It's they are getting bigger and bigger. And so more people are buying, fewer people buy more land. And so in my view, this is a kind of re-feudalization that's going on. Same in European countries, in the Eastern European countries with land, in Romania, for example, a former Soviet Union country. So you can see that industrial companies buy land massively without the state can intervene whatsoever. And it's part of capitalism for sure, but the special aspect is that there is a power concentration and no control whatsoever. I don't know whether that also for the audience or for whoever.
Yeah. If somebody in the audience wants to answer, is welcome. But I think in the case with Colombia is different also because they never had a agrarian reform, right? We here had an agrarian reform in the 19th. Well, we had like 3, but the only one that still is remembered is the one that Velasco did in the 1969. But it's important to note that the hacienda was not only an economic phenomenon, it was also a social cultural phenomenon. So it was a complex space where all these colonial forms of power take place. And right now, I think in Peru, we're living a reconcentration of land in the hands of big corporations, also capital agroexportador, right? The biggest company in Peru has like 3 times the land that the biggest hacienda had before the agrarian reform right now. But I think it's a different kind of domination, right? And a different kind of mechanism that are used to appropriate that land. Yeah. For example, the phenomenon of expropriation with the criteria, with the intermediation of the state, and the justification that, for example, lands that are not in use are property of state, and then are put in the market just for people that can afford to buy that land. So also big corporations. Yeah.
I think there are 2 separate questions that this discussion combines. One question is about the different forms of colonialism and imperialism. So as a kind of ideal type, you can say that there are, generally speaking, 2 broad ideal types of colonialism. One is settler colonialism, and the other is the more classical model of imperial domination. So a classical imperial model, right, is a hierarchical model in which a very small number of powerful elites control a much larger racialized population, primarily for the purposes of extracting value from their labor and the resources that they are going to be doing the work to extract, gold, whatnot. And then in settler colonialism, the pyramid gets inverted, where the colonizers come to be the dominant or overwhelming majority of the population. And their primary aim is not to preserve the underlying indigenous infrastructure and expropriate wealth from them as workers, but rather to exterminate that population, either by removal, forced displacement, or literal extermination. Because then the primary target is not their labor, but their land, right? And so these 2 models are ideal types. There's no country that perfectly corresponds to one or the other. They're hybridized versions of all of them in all places. But I think that helps us begin to think about how capitalism expresses itself differently through different kinds of colonial projects. And Latin America has, of course, a kind of complex archipelago of combinations of these, where it slides more towards the settler colonial form in places like Argentina, in places where, in more northern part of South America, you have more the kind of classical model. So that's one question, is like, why are there different kinds of imperialisms? How do they take place in different forms? How are they combined in unique ways? A slightly different question is this question of the whole relationship to capitalism and neo-feudalization. And here I'll also reference the work of Rocio, who we heard from earlier, who's working a lot on these kinds of questions. And I think this is a very, in a sense, a more challenging problem for a kind of classical Marxist account. Because a classical Marxist account, in my view, can, of course, acknowledge the existence of all kinds of other forms of other kinds of political economies, either subsistence economies, traditional economies, but also feudal and semi-feudal forms of social organization. But typically, classical Marxist accounts will explain that through the language of failure to transition. So it's like these feudal structures endure into the present longer than one might expect, simply because they haven't yet been fully capitalized. So that's not yet completed. They're like frozen in time. They're sort of stuck and they endure longer than one would expect. But a much more challenging argument is that these feudal structures are not just enduring, but they're actually growing in strength, and they're beginning to overtake more dominant or classical forms of capitalism under free market exchange and so on. And that's a much more challenging picture for a classical Marxist account, because one of the things that classical Marxists would typically have said is that exploitation through free working, through free proletarianized labor, what makes it superior, not morally superior, is that it's just much more efficient, because other forms of work, enslavement and feudal indenture, you have to force workers, physically compel them to do the work. A better method is not to physically compel anyone to do anything, but to divest them of subsistence and then wait for them to come to you. Then they'll be desperate to work for you. So it's much more efficient as a mode of extraction. You should be able to get a lot more value out of free workers than you will out of indentured laborers or slaves, right? So on that model, classical exploitation should, in the long run, always outcompete other forms of extraction, whether they're enslavement or indentured servitude under feudalism. So if feudalism is not just enduring because we haven't yet gotten to it yet, the capitalists haven't fully arrived in all places of the world, but in fact it's growing, it's expanding, and it's overtaking, in some cases, classical exploitation, that's a bigger problem. That's a puzzle one would have to solve differently, because one would have to explain why it can overtake classical capitalist relations. And that's where I think like all this work that Rocio was mentioning to do with racial capitalism and how racial social formations, in a sense, subtend a lot of actually existing capitalist relations, helps us to explain why those things can be not just enduring, but actually growing and beginning to, in a sense, supplant other kinds of relationships.
Thank you, Robert. I think it's a good summary. I have another question for every one of you guys. What do you think are the principal transformations that in the forms of dispossession take place in the neoliberal era?
It's our topic. Thank you very much for the question. Well, yes, I can start there. So many new forms of dispossession under neoliberal conditions. So I would like to mention here just some. And one is what we have talked about already during the conference is what we call financialization. That means this is a way of betting on the future, how the market may look like under certain conditions. So it's a bet on the future. But that comes together with a kind of, it's beyond the state and the way the state can control. Dealing with these property aspects. So it's about the asset development and the future betting without being based on demand structures. So it's beyond the Marxist idea of the circle of production and so on. That's no longer need. Another challenge is who owns these new kinds of property or not yet property like data. So all kinds of immaterial aspects of property. It's also not clear yet who owns that. It's what we heard by Robert. Maybe this is something we haven't had possession on yet. But it's clear that somebody else in the future, big companies, may have a grip on that without the users asking what they think about that. And that has, thirdly, that leads to artificial intelligence and more general terms, because what does that do with language? And language use. So we think, since I studied with Habermas, it has been mentioned, so then it was all about argumentation and the way one deals with the better arguments, A and B, think about C, a good, for example, and who possesses that good, and what kind of relationship that is. But if we think about language becomes corrupted in the sense that it's unclear who is speaking, a bot, a computer. So then the question is, whose meaning is it in the end? And who determines what is right or wrong and what has been said and how meaning comes into the world. So it's a way of no longer possess your own language. So that is a very fundamental way of dispossession, I think. Not to speak then about the gender and the racialized aspect. I'm just mentioning it because the real possessions like houses and assets and so, it's very much male dominated. So we can see worldwide those who possess these things and goods and have power. It's also stratified by gender. It's it's racialized at the same time. And so it's a kind of dispossession of those who do not belong to the predominant class, group, and so on. So these are just a few aspects I mentioned.
About neoliberalism? I don't know if I have much to say about well, very quickly, there are, I think, two broad schools that try to think through the question of neoliberalism, and they interact. They're not kind of mutually exclusive. One is a more Marxist school, so I'm thinking like David Harvey. And on that view, neoliberalism is primarily characterized by things like deregulation and privatization. So it's a transformation of the state form, where the state is essentially emptied out and deregulates and devolves state functions into private actors. And it does so in part to offload responsibility onto private actors, things which used to be the functions of the state, like the provision of healthcare or education, but also because in that moment of devolution, it's an opportunity to seize public assets, right? So a classic example is when you privatize a public pension plan, you effectively seize public assets and you turn them into privately controlled assets. So it's in a form, what he calls accumulation by dispossession. It's a form of accumulating value without actually generating anything new. It's more by just appropriating what was there. So that's kind of one framework for thinking about it. The other is more Foucauldian influenced, right? And this is the idea that neoliberalism is not just a set of policies. It's not just deregulation and so on. It's a kind of rationality. It's a way that we it's a form of subjectivity. It starts to be in part of how we conduct ourselves in the world, particularly through a kind of self-commodification process, whereby increasingly we come to experience ourselves and relate to ourselves as always already a kind of commodification process. And that, to me, helps explain a lot of like new social media. You think some of the largest companies in the world started by not producing anything at all. All they produced was a medium through which private people could themselves provide all the content, right? So Facebook and Amazon, and these are enormous, the largest corporations in the world don't actually make anything. And you don't even have to pay to be a member of it because you're the producer. But there's no way to distinguish the product from the person doing the producing because you're both the producer and the product. That's what, this is the model that Facebook runs on. Or Uber and these kinds of things where they're really just a medium to integrate and connect people. And it becomes virtually impossible to distinguish who's the producer and who's the consumer because the person is themselves the product. And so there's a kind of neoliberal rationality or form of subjectivity that we come to inhabit. And I think that's another dimension of neoliberalism that's really important to attend to.
Just to add to that great description of the different kind of objective and subjective aspects of neoliberalism, I think one more thing that's dispossessed in neoliberalism is, I would say, political power or democracy, right? So what a lot of people tend to think that neoliberalism is the weakening of the state, But I say in the last 10 to 15 years, there's kind of been a revolution in thinking about neoliberalism as a strengthening of the state against the democratic power of people. So that's why you can have an authoritarian neoliberal combination. It's not contradictory at all. So to have laws that remove power from people requires strong states, right? It requires strong power, but only in certain aspects. So not over like public goods, which are gone, but to reject but to control the fact that people can make lots of choices in neoliberalism about their media, their identity, their clothes, but they cannot choose to defend their land against, extraction from international companies, or they cannot fight the property laws of the IMF or the WTO. That's beyond democracy. That's international law. So, and you need like a strong state to do that. So I think neoliberalism is also a dispossession of that power to a higher level as a way of protecting property rights against democracy.
Thank you, Jacob. I think in regard to that description of the state in the neoliberal era in Peru, for example, Peru is an example in the 90s, right? Because under neoliberalism, for example, with Fujimorismo, a lot of rights, land rights especially, were taken away. And also expropriation arises there as a specific form of dispossession by the state, and it was put in the law. Yeah. So dispossession is kind of legalized in the 90s here in Peru, but under the criteria of the public interest, right? But in reality, it's the private interest what lies at the base. So, for example, there are a lot of laws for the land law of the 93, the tiling projects, PET 1, PET 2, also there's a PET 3. And well, there's an example, no? The state determines, for example, a given space is not being used and becomes state property. The expropriation is justified, no? Because that space is public interest. And although it may later be concession to industrial or extracted capital, right? Through exclusionary mechanisms. For example, the work of Tanya O'Reilly enters here very well. For example, selling the land at prices only accessible to big capital. I mentioned this before. So, in conclusion, I will say that during the implementation of neoliberalism in Peru in the 90s, there's a kind of dispossession whose mechanisms have become more sophisticated with a lot of state power, a lot of authoritarianism, and without stopping to generate violent incorporation of indigenous as peasant people under legal forms. So, in the base of all of this is also the private property regime, right? Which excludes for example, the indigenous people, the peasant communities as personas no civilizadas, right? So yeah, we have a good example here, like a laboratory in Peru about neoliberalism. Yeah.
Well, and I think we heard today already earlier a brilliant example of how this plays out in the presentation that was about abortion politics here. Because part of what I was thinking when I was listening to that was that, part of the problematic that was trying to be explored there is that the massive criminalization of abortion does nothing to actually diminish the rate of abortions in it, right? There are places where abortion is highly legal, is open and available, but they have very low rates of abortion, right? Well, why? Because that decriminalization can be supplemented by things like the provision of basic health care for all, education, access to, and economic security for women. So really what is taking place in the criminalization of abortion has nothing to do with trying to diminish the number of abortions. It's the transformation of the state away from provisions and redistribution of wealth and the provisions of public health care and education into a punitive apparatus that essentially privatizes the costs of abortion. So it doesn't have to be born publicly, it has to be born privately. And then you have the rise of all this privatization of things like abortion medication and whatnot. So one way of thinking about the endurance of the seeming strangeness of this apparatus of criminalization when it has no demonstrable effect on the actual abortion rates is that it's symptomatic of this transformation of the state. And I think that one of the ways in which we often inadvertently reproduce this kind of logic is in the popular discourse that presents the distinction between the left and the right as a distinction between those who want small government and those who want big government, right? But really the better distinction is the right thinks of the primary purpose of the government as a punitive apparatus. It is very willing to invest massive amounts of money and massive amounts of power in the state. But when they think of the state, they're thinking of the military, and they're thinking of the police, and they're thinking of prisons. And the massive expansion of that as coterminous with the complete emptying out of this other vision of the state, which is that the primary purpose of the state is to function to redistribute wealth and to provide public goods, as Jacob said, defined by a democratic process. So the complete collapse of that vision of the state and the rise of the other is a better way of framing the distinction, this kind of oscillation between right wing and left wing, rather than a vision of sort of small state, large state. Right? It's more qualitatively different visions of what is the purpose of a state.
Can I say? Or there's another matter on the loss of the state and the transferring of the, let's say, welfare state in different forms of the world into the neoliberal state. And this is a psychological level. So how do we deal with these new demands, like taking care of ourselves when it comes to healthcare, pension scheme, making career, and so on. It's in a way, for me, it's always a kind of elephant in the room that if we need to ask ourselves also to bring down the level a bit here of discussion. So what would we do? So why are some people at least are still taking part in this whole system? Why is it so important to get one's own apartment? Why is it so important to have maybe a piece of land somewhere, buying assets and so on? How far would we go not do consumption a lot anymore? And so this kind of self-reflection on our personal habits is also one aspect of it. Having said that, I am not the one saying it's only about an ethical question, because I think it is always something to do with the structures behind that needed to be changed. But for that, one needs to know what is going on, which is an epistemic question. It's very difficult very often. It's a question of knowledge and power. But at the same time, it's the question, who can change what's going on? It's a question of the political. And who can do something against it. We have talked about resistance here also. And we have a lot of resistance movements going on, but they are absolutely ineffective. They come and go, and nothing is going to be changed. Why is that so? Because also in most of the countries, the channels, the institutional channels between the public sphere and the parliaments, weaker or stronger parliaments, are kind of has been weakened. It's kind of destroyed. It's no longer there. And also from a theory point of view, many do not even argue in favor of that, in favor of the institutionalization of what's going on in the public sphere. And so I also see on both levels, on a political level, the problem, but also on the theory level, that institutional democracy is also, for many of critical theorists, no longer really a topic, but it needs to be linked also to the question, so who is buying actually what? And why is it for us so important to have private property rights? And housing is one of these cases, you know. So it's so important to have your own apartment. So.
Thank you. Continuing with this topic about social resistance and social movements, civil disobedience also. I think here in Peru, the landscape is kind of desolating also. Desolating because social movements in general and peasants and indigenous movements in particular have been disarticulated and fragmented alongside left and progressive political organizations. Also because of the neoliberal policies that were implemented since the 90s. But they're still going. For example, the protests, the movements we've experienced since December the last year were proof that the movement is still going, but it's also very fragmented. And also this protest was about a lot of demands that were linked to the historical territorial dispossession of peasant and indigenous communities. So I want to ask you also if you find movements or forms of social resistance or civil disobedience that are worth noting, especially in relation to the defense of land resources, housing, and if you think these movements problematize the form itself of property, and why they are like you said, Regina, failing.
Yeah, tough question. I mean, I think there has been resistance, there is resistance, there will be resistance. It's almost a given when people are threatened with their livelihood, they resist. The question is, what form does it take? In what period? And how do we, as theorists, critical theorists, understand it, conceptualize it, make sense of it, articulate it, point to its potentials and limitations? I think is the task of the theorist, to think with them and against them sometimes as well. I'll just take one example from Berlin, where I live. There's been skyrocketing rents in the last 10 years. Rents have been doubling, and because of international investments in housing properties, because of a privatization of housing stock from before, because of neoliberalization, housing rents have risen really high. And there's been attempts to resist it with, occupations of buildings or like a little protest against evictions. So there's been direct individual resistance, street resistance, neighborhood resistance, and sometimes they win, but they mostly lose because it's very hard to have power against these structures, which are usually invisible, opaque, as Regina said in her lecture, right? It's very hard to see who is owning these buildings. In the last 3 years, though, there's been a new campaign. Instead of being on the defensive to say, okay, we want to defend this building or this house or this tenant, there's been a new campaign to directly go after these large landowners, these large landlords in Berlin. It's called the Deutsche Wohnungen und Co. Enteignung. It's called the Expropriate Deutsche Wohnungen und Co. And it's a campaign to socialize housing where landlords own more than 3,000 properties. So if a landlord owns more than 3,000 properties, the idea is this should be socialized, right? Which means not nationalized. It doesn't mean given to the state. It means creating a new body of tenants, of neighbors, of representatives of government, of experts to manage and control this building in the interest of the public good, in the interest of those who need it, right? So it's neither purely public nor purely private. It's this idea to socialize, to transform property relations for new needs, for new functions. This was a referendum in 2019. A referendum in 2021, which passed with 59% of the population, which is an amazing victory. And then for 2 years, they've been debating it. And now there's a new law that they're going to try to do to make it, to force it. So I think this is really interesting to think about these strategies which go beyond resistance in terms of just fighting against that which dominates you and try to seize it, transform it. And that takes, power and organizing and composing a subject, which is very difficult to do in these times of atomization and neoliberalization, especially.
Well, my thoughts are very much, I think, consonant with what Regina had to say, because I don't think that the problem is so much imaginative in the sense of trying to come up with alternatives. I think when framed properly, capitalist forms of private property are very unusual. They are very exceptional. The norm across time and space is lots of other kinds. We have endless examples of other ways of relating to the earth, of relating to one another, that by far the much more dominant form of life on earth is non-capitalist and does not relate to the earth, in particular through forms of exclusive ownership. That's true globally, but it's even true in the European tradition, right? For the vast majority of time and the vast majority of humans did not live like this. This is actually quite unusual. So the first step is to just provincialize it, to not take it as if it is the norm and all these other things are exceptions, but it's the exception. And the forms of communal life, socialized life are the rule. And capitalist private property, especially over land, is the exception to that rule. So it's not that we lack ideas of how else to organize life. The problem, we don't lack ideas, we lack power. We don't have the ability to enforce our other ideas against this other model because we don't have the capacity to leverage the same amount of power. And that, I think, is historically the dilemma, right? It's that if there are 10 people, 9 of whom wish to live life according to values like sustainability and mutual reciprocity and aid and so on. So the vast majority, 9 out of 10, organize life around these other kinds of values. All it takes is one person who says their primary form of life is to aggregate as much power as possible through maximum exploitation of others and of the natural world. If there is just one person like that, then we have a problem because we have to build power at least sufficient enough to stop that person. Even if we don't want power, it's not our primary value, we need secondarily to want it enough to stop that person. Because then, if we don't, either that person will dominate over the rest of us, or we have to join them and become them. And I think that's slowly the kind of process that we've been seeing over the last little while, right? It's not that these other forms of life don't exist, they remain in existence, but they remain essentially powerless in the face of this dilemma to either become like the enemy and try to aggregate as much power as possible, minimally to stop them, or to just capitulate to them. And I do think that within a sort of auto-critique of the left is that the left does have a tendency, especially I would say in the last 20 years, as there's a kind of moralistic tone that has developed and is a sort of ribbon that runs through the left, where the goal is not so much to institutionalize and alternative forms by building power and building capacity, but rather to make a virtue out of weakness, to say, well, at least we're not these powerful people, so at least morally we're clean because we're kind of on the outside, on the exterior, and we've kept our hands clean by not doing what is necessary to build power. And so we try to turn weakness into a virtue. And I think that that's a kind of moralistic strand that sometimes runs through leftist politics that prevents us in advance from ever succeeding. Because it means if we ever were to succeed, that would be a sign of capitulation in a sense. We would have become like them. And I think that ensures permanent failure. If you think that there's no form of building power that is, that all forms of building power are problematic and so on, what you do is you ensure in advance permanent subordination. And so one has to distinguish between democratic and legitimate forms of collective power from illegitimate forms of power, and then you try to build and institutionalize that. And I would say one of the big dilemmas right now is exactly as Regina mentioned it, is that we are very good at protest politics, but very bad at translating those into more stable, institutionalized forms of power that have the capacity to push back against the powerful. And as long as that remains the problem, then all we'll have is a kind of sour grapes politics where we say, well, we failed, but we're better for having failed.
If I may add something, this is a symptom of our neoliberal societies. So it's a loss of common sense and of what can be common and what can be shared. So this highly individualism paired with self-responsibility demand undermines a way dealing in a solidaric way to get done some political issues. Secondly, there is on the left, and I'm speaking now for the European societies, I'm not so sure whether it's for here, but it might be also on the right-wing side. But for the left, I can say there is a kind of, in German, Sektierertum. It's a kind of internal internal separateness that is also kind of poisoning any leftist idea. And on the top of it, that's where I maybe disagree a bit. It is good to have tactics and to be not moralistic. I completely agree. But I think very often the attitude that one tends not to do is very nice, the negation. I think it's very important. But one needs to have more practical visions how to overcome the current situation. And very often, also our theory approaches do not offer that. So it is the more difficult part right now. I see this, but I think it's a misunderstanding if one thinks that critical theory is not able to show where the critical remarks, where the resistance can take place. And that should be, in that very weak sense, in that negatively weak sense, that should be part of critical theory. I would like to mention very briefly, one positive aspect. And this is happened in Spain, 2011. And I think it's a very good example how it happened, but it's 10, 12, 13 years ago in a way. So maybe that's also the difference. This is the Plataforma de Afectados por la Hipoteca. And so they were relatively successful. They were fighting these were squatters fighting for regaining housing after they got expropriated and evicted through the bank policies. And then Spain, the state, took that over into made it a law that it's even still possible to get. So that was one of the very, very few examples where there has been a kind of reciprocity between the public sphere and the parliament, the legal setting up of rules. But other than that, one last word, I think, and that might go just to underpin also the moralization aspect here, we should one should maybe think about bringing together the political identity discourse about racialism, sexism, Islamophobism, anti-Semitism, and so which I consider to be very important, and the anti-capitalist, anti-neoliberal discourse. So to bring those two together, because right now they are still, even though there are some good examples to bring those together, but it's still separated. And the whole debate about racialized capitalism is a very good start with that, I think.
I wanted to disagree with Robert, but I don't think there's time. There's always time? Okay, I think there is a lack of power and a lack of ideas. The question is power for what? Power to gain what? Power to do what? There's been a long tradition of rejecting visions of the future in critical theory. I mean, starting with Marx, hitting its apogee with Adorno. The idea is that any vision of the future will lack something, will always miss something, will always leave something out. It'll freeze a certain picture in time, and that vision will then be used against people to dominate them. So there's a strong anti-utopian strand in critical theory. Also, people themselves should be left to envision their own futures, right? Those who struggle. But I think this is a misconception of the task of critical theory. I think the task of critical theory is not only to criticize society, but to but in that critique show another form of life that's possible, right? At the same time, and one that is also open to reflection, to discussion as an object. I mean, movements for hundreds of years have crystallized around visions of a better future. And that is something we're completely lacking today, right? So these visions, these utopian visions, even when they're false, can be very useful. I think that's something very difficult to do. And I'm not saying that like academics should just make plans and distribute them to the people, but help that process within struggles themselves to formulate ideas that are sometimes incoherent or sometimes unarticulated. And I think that is an essential part of the development of power as well.
Yep, I think here we have also that lack of in the movements, especially in the movements in relation to land, dispossession, and natural resources, that lack of imagination and power, because there are a lot of federations in the Amazon, indigenous federations, movements, but they all are now debating with the state in the terms that the state impose. And that terms are exchange value, like in private property. So every time when these movements try to push the debate towards territorial visions or other logics of space disposition that exceed land mercantilizations, there comes a state with an organ of class domination, like Lenin said, right? Like with the police, the military forces, the media also now. I think this kind of context produces like you, Jacob, said, like a closed future. Like they cannot like imagine a new future in those conditions. So, for example, they are still pushing projects like Territorios Integrales. That's a project where the territory is thought in a logic of space disposition that is not productive in relation to production or class or value production, but the federations always negotiate with the state and claudicates those projects. So I think the problem here is that they also have no articulation with political parties, with left movements of bigger, de amplia base, mucho más grandes. And so there is a lack of power. And the lack of imagination comes when the state push their forces together with the military, the police, the forces every time. So yeah. So now it's time for questions from the public, so we can close this night. Si alguien quiere comentar, también puede hacerlo en español.
Sí, se habló en un momento acerca de la falta de poder, pero también de vías institucionalizadas en las que se puede plantear un proyecto político, digamos, ¿no? Y la forma clásica en la que se piensa que se puede hacer esto, la plataforma con la que se puede hacer esto son los partidos. los partidos políticos, ¿no? Una manera de institucionalizarlo, lo que en un momento puede ser los movimientos, ¿no? Pero en Perú, por lo menos, los científicos políticos, la literatura sobre los partidos, es que aquí no tenemos partidos como tales. Tenemos coaliciones independientes que son agregados de individuos que buscan intereses particulares, ¿no? Privados. Y es el tipo de sistema, el tipo de sistema político que tenemos, ¿no? Entonces, ¿qué cabida o qué forma de institucionalizarlo, qué entrada podemos tener para ver si es que realmente los partidos todavía pueden ser una vía en la que buscamos esta institucionalización, ¿no? Al momento de querer promulgar un proyecto político, ¿no? Que incluya tanto las ideas y las propuestas, digamos, el mito que impulsa la acción, ¿no? Y las visiones sobre un futuro, pero también que incluya esta capacidad de almacenar ese poder que se requiere para instaurar un partido, ¿no? Entonces, ¿en qué entrada o qué discusiones que incluyen la teoría crítica existen y están en debate para impulsar los partidos o una forma alternativa a estos, ¿no? ¿Hay una discusión sobre esto?
I think, so I'm a big proponent of the idea of multiple strategies simultaneously operating. I think that rather than asking the question, what is the form of institutionalization, is rather to think of diverse forms and then more on a spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum, you have the formal institution of the party, a political party, right? And on the other end, you have spontaneous social movements that erupt usually more around specific issues, some topic like the building of an airport or something, right? But you have a whole range of intermediary institutions. This is social organizations and the role that unions used to play as the intermediary body between parties and spontaneous social movements, right? And today, I think another example of that is cooperatives. So cooperatives are, as Jacob was talking about with regard to housing, is a kind of intermediary institution that tries to institutionalize alternative relationships of ownership, but also of governance. Because the central idea of a cooperative is that the workers are also the owners of the company. And so that's important not just as a way of dividing property, but as dividing relationships of power, because to be an owner of it means you get a voice in the direction of it, which is different from just being a shareholder, right? Or having a kind of property interest without a political control. So there are, I think, a variety of like intermediary organizations. The problem to me, as I say, is less that we don't have these things. I always think, there's that slogan, the old New Social Forum kind of slogan that another reality is possible, but I always say it's actual. It is already existing. The problem is more of trying to coordinate across this range of different things. I still think ultimately one needs a party because one needs some kind of way of trying to appropriate the structure of the state. But that is very easily collapses into just being, all the problems that we're very familiar with, how disastrous most parties, including almost all leftist parties, become. They just become, co-opted by the state form. So they still have to be grounded in social movements and in these intermediary kinds of institutions that are like co-ops, like unions, like the kinds of social organizations that are neither spontaneous eruptions of protests nor formal institutions of the state, like parties. And the question then becomes more a question of how to better integrate the function of those different types of organizations.
I mostly agree. So it's I completely. However, in one point I disagree. It's about the empirical side, because there are new studies again for the European societies, and one can see that during the last 10, 15 years, the structure, the intermediate structure, has is no longer there in the way it has been, like less unions, less associations, less voluntary work, less voluntary institutions. Why? Because people are no longer they are busy with their making career, or no, who knows, but they are no longer so much busy in these kind of intermediate institutions. So it has been a kind of derogated. It's no longer there as it was used to. It might be different in Canada. I don't know, maybe. But that's we are really missing these kind of intermediate institutions. And that was what I said before. I mean, I'm still thinking it's so important to not just have protests in the streets all the time, because that put pressure on the political institutions, that's for clear. But it will not have a real effect. The second problem is whom to address. And so especially when it comes to housing, yes. I mean, so whom to address? The real estate companies, the state, many then protest against the state, or the individual little house owners. And so this has been so over complex that very often it's unclear whom to address. And that's why, for example, the right-wing movements, they just address those people there, the politicians. So that's easy. They have the easy answers. And the leftish movement, they don't want to have these kind of easy answers. They want to come up with these easy answers. And for them, it's then a problem. So whom to address? And third, you can see we had Blockupy, we had Occupy, we had all these kinds of movement, and the way they are organized, I think it's also a structural internal problem. And I took part in the Blockupy and Occupy movement, and I had a more internal look, and it was because one communicates through the platforms. But there's hardly any kind of common idea. It's kind of fluid. It's not really stable, which is nice at the same time because it's not so hierarchical. But at the same time, it's kind of unverbindlich. It's kind of but nobody feels in a way is really responsible. And it's just for a short period of time, and then people are busy with other things. So, and how to come up with that stabilized, ongoing, enduring, responsible political activity is really a challenge nowadays. And I've not really an answer to that.
Just very quickly, there's an interesting book called Ruling the Void, which is about it tries to answer the questions: why don't parties represent people anymore? Why do people not vote anymore? How have parties been hollowed out? How has their core mission been evacuated? And what that means for politics and society today. I think it's a very interesting study, and it shows you the limits of modern political parties as opposed to large-scale parties that represented a certain class or a certain movement of people, and why they're so difficult to coalesce around, why they serve their own interests. And it poses a problem. It doesn't have a solution, but it poses a problem. On the other hand, I think we live in an era of protests. We live in an era of riots. Like in 2019, there's a peak of global protest activity in the world. Dissatisfaction empirically with governments is higher than ever in 2019 to 2021. There's so much political dissatisfaction, and yet no kind of vehicle to channel that into institutionalized reform. And I think that is a problem that people need to answer. That's not like that's the condition that we are living in, and we are trying to work through collectively right now. And I think that's the task of all of us. What does it mean to compose us up, to unify, to make a vehicle? Thank you.
Gracias. ¿Cuál creen que es el futuro de la relación entre los estudios sobre los cambios estructurales de la propiedad y la epistemología política y social. Si pensamos que la propiedad tiene que ver mucho con toma de decisiones, es decir, yo sé que algo es mío porque puedo decidir sobre ello y los demás están excluidos de decidir sobre algo. Eso pasa, por ejemplo, en el caso de las cooperativas, que ha mencionado también Robert. Una cooperativa es una asociación de productores, de agentes que deciden de forma colectiva acerca de algo, a diferencia de una empresa típica donde es un directorio el que toma todas las decisiones relevantes. Entonces, pensando en la importancia de la noción de proceso de toma de decisión en la economía y en relación a la propiedad, mi pregunta es entonces, ¿cómo podemos imaginarnos que va a ser la teoría crítica en el futuro tratando de vincular la epistemología con problemas vinculados con la propiedad?
Bueno, with the last bit of voice that I have, I wanted to ask about, so first I wanted to respond to this conversation about protests and what has come of it. I have from Puerto Rico, so one of the big uprisings was in Puerto Rico, and my partner is from Colombia, and one of the big uprisings was in Colombia, and both have concrete political outcomes that are in fact being dismantled as we speak. So right now there were, how do you say, like local elections in Colombia yesterday. There's a whole campaign to kind of by way of terror argue again that what they need is to go back to a right-wing government, because Petro and Francia Marquez are the first left-wing, and they are in fact restituting lands. They are in fact putting in place a variety of structures that are very imperfect, but they're faced with a very well-oiled machine of right-wing politics for decades. So I do think that something has come out. I know Chile's a very complicated case that I don't know enough about. In Puerto Rico, right now, the governor in place is elected by 30% because there was a fragmentation of the parties. And now there's, with the elections, there are primaries right now. And there is an articulation of two new parties to have a strategy to finally oust. At the same time, the right-wing and very religious, transphobic, very well-organized machine, at the same time is, they're the statehood party. They're the colonial party. They want to bring back the governor that we ousted, and have him as a resident commissioner, the non-voting member in Congress. In between, there has been a whole set of practices of political formation that are local. And they have to do a lot with precisely this question of property and land, in particular around tax exemption in Puerto Rico, new colonial invasions by Americans that are coming, and buying up all the land because they're evading taxes. There's just a long-standing history and very concrete, articulations in these two spaces that I know quite well. So I think it's false to say that there's protest without traction. But I think that it's not a question of, and this is my second question, and maybe they're just one, that is not a question of knowledge, and it's not a question of utopia. I think it's a question of desire. What do we desire? And I think we desire capital. what capital gives us in many ways. I mean, I want to say that I don't desire it, but it manifests itself in many ways. I see it in my students. I see it in my family who are not leftist radicals or intellectuals. So I think it's a question of desire. I see it also in radical politics, who also think about self-care, right, in totally commodified ways. So I don't think people are confused. I think we need to not just dismantle structures, we have to dismantle ourselves.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't have, of course, answers to any of these very large sorts of problems. And I echo something that Jacob said earlier, which is, of course, that it's not even the proper function, I think, of political theory or critical theory to be able to kind of directly answer or offer programmatic responses to these things, but rather offer more of the larger scale diagnosis of the broader terrain. And then to point to moments and places where social movements are themselves generating the answers, right? It's not. I would say two things in response to the general tenor of kind of the conversation. The first is that I think on the left, we do have to give ourselves a little bit of a break, because it is, of course, structurally always going to be the case that the left will feel it is losing, because that's built into the whole idea is that you're trying to fight for people who are oppressed and dominated. It's much easier to fight for the powerful. There will always be, so you will always perpetually feel in a position of failure and inadequacy, because that's the starting premise of the whole project, is to work with, for, people who are essentially powerless. And if you start from there, you're going to feel like you're never really in power and in control, right? And so there's something structurally built into this that means that's why to defend the interests of wealthy capitalists is much easier the place to be in, right, than to defend people who have no power, no voice, no resources. They're marginalized, they're excluded, surplus populations. That is, it will just always be the case, I think. So on the one hand, I think, we, I think, need to give ourselves a little bit of a break on that regard, and to just accept that there is something intrinsic to the idea of progressive politics, that it will always feel as if it is failing relative to the enormity of the task in front of us. That said, of course, there is an empirical wax and wane of that over time. And it is also true that more empirically, descriptively, we are losing, right? The rise of the far right globally and the global circulation of far right discourses is ascendant right now. And that's a problem both in and of itself, but also because of the larger environmental catastrophe that we are experiencing. So even if we hold the line, we're losing, because time is running out. We don't have the luxury to just keep, the same position. So even if we keep in a static position, we're losing, because we're running off a cliff now. And so it's not enough to just hold the line. We have to be overtaking them. And the fact is that we are losing right now. I think part of the reason why we're losing is that the far right has been able to expertly appropriate a lot of the language and grammar of the left to speak to the desires of people. Because if you listen to a lot of far right discourse, it is actually similar formally to a lot of traditional leftist concerns. They'll say, these globalists, they don't care about, the common person, and we're really in favor of national community and traditional values and virtues, and they don't care about this. They're just trying to dominate us. So they appropriate a lot of the formal language of a leftist discourse, but then of course for them the answer is, well, why do people feel powerless? Why do people on the right? They also feel powerless, right? And so they're vulnerable to that kind of discourse because they don't want to feel like powerless. But what they do is then they diagnose the source of that problem differently. They say, wow, it's these foreigners, it's gay and trans people, right? It's not powerful, wealthy billionaires who are the cause of this, but the most marginalized people in society are part of it. So they, in a sense, take up a lot of the kind of sense of powerlessness in the face of very abstract and impersonal forms of domination, and they convert it into and project it downward on the most vulnerable people. And I think that we need to study better how they're able to do that and appropriate some of those features away from the left and use them as part of right politics in order to understand how they're gaining traction. So there are large numbers of people for whom this really resonates for them because they're tapping into that sense of powerlessness. And I think that's another way in which the left can start to gain a little bit more traction is to speak, as you said, to some of the basic desires that people want to feel secure, and they want to feel like they're not perpetually vulnerable, and they want to feel like they're part of a community. And fascist, neo-fascist forms of discourse are all about, community and bindedness together and so on. So they appropriate that away from a kind of leftist idiom. And I think we have to figure out how to wrestle that back from them, or we're losing, as you say, this kind of subjective dimension of the struggle.
Yeah, thank you very much. I also think, and one problem is that there is a kind of class divide within political activity. So if you think about corporations and and housing or land use, then we those having mostly highly educated, are we really willing to communicate with those who are not so able to communicate? It is really a problem. And we can see that, and some of those projects, and it comes to housing cooperatives, these are really niche projects. So also sharing cars in European cities. If you look who really does this is just a minority. It's not really. It started as a huge model, but it's not. So in the European societies, the ownership of cars are so much increasing. People now have 2 cars, 3 cars. Nevertheless, anybody's talking about not needing the cars anymore, but it's absolutely not true. So that's one thing. Another thing is absolutely, thank you. So giving us some hope here, and with the Colombian case, but the desire, and I think you put it so nicely. It's so what do people desire? I mean, they may desire the wrong things, and how to deal with that? It's really difficult. I read Mark Fisher, who died very early already, 5 years ago, and he spoke about the closed future, and that the only future perspective that seems to be left nowadays is on the technical level. So we have new iPhones and new other technical devices, and we think we can solve the ecological problems through more technique and linked to economic growth and so on. So the question, and there's hardly any cultural future prospects anymore. And the question is also for critical theorists, so why nevertheless become active? And it's this question, so why nevertheless? So it's in a way, if you want to put it, like you said, desire, but one can also put it in the ideas of hope, kind of Messian hope. We know it doesn't make so much sense, and we will never reach a just society, but we nevertheless try again and again. but knowing that we may not reach it. So that might be the why we are doing it, and why maybe. And then there are some positive examples that keep us going.
Yeah, thank you, Rocio and Gianfranco. I think, yes, of course, we desire capital, but capital is it's an antagonistic relationship as well, and there's conflictual relationships within capital. But there's also something utopian about capitalism that maybe we should desire, right? So tourism, as we heard before, it gives us a utopian image of ourselves that we want to pursue. Consumption, right? Advertising gives us a utopian vision of free time to just consume things all the time without work. So yeah, capitalism, I think, takes these utopian desires and gives them back to us and says, this is what you can do through me. And I think, we shouldn't just reject that and be people are deluded through ideology. I think that there is maybe a desire for freedom, for free time, for community, for connection to nature that we lack. And so how do you use that to be like, yes, there is a utopian desire there that you're being denied, actually. Is that possible to kind of work within it, like immanent critique of that desire? It's difficult, and yeah, but I think it's there. And just on the very complicated question of like the epistemic conception of property for a critical theory of the future, just one comment is maybe so property in many ways is a way of thinking about the authority to take decisions over a good, right? It's a question of normativity. Who has the power? Who has the authority to say what can be used in certain ways? It's a social question. Maybe in the future, or there's a reversal that's possible, a way of thinking about property not from the perspective of the subject, but as like some colleagues who we work with, inspired by Adorno, would say, what if we start from the perspective of the object, right? What if we kind of take the knowledge of a good, like the knowledge of a mountain, a river, of a transportation system, of complex science, and we say, these goods have particular qualities that we need to know about that reflect back to us how we should, own them or not own them. I think maybe there's a certain relationship to knowledge that requires a more embeddedness in kind of the object itself that I think is right now beginning to be thought through and understood instead of only a perspective of the subject, right? Which treats everything as flat. The world is just the things. So I would say this could be an interesting line of inquiry for the future.
Thank you, Jacob. It's a pity we don't have more time, but I want to thank you guys for the conversation and your perspective. Y a todas y todos ustedes por acompañarnos en este cierre con esta mesa redonda de las 10ª jornadas de Teoría Crítica. Muchas gracias y un aplauso para los ponentes.
I would like to start by saying thank you to Gianfranco and everybody who organized this fantastic conference here. It was such an insightful and very pleasant endeavor. And I would like to thank you, and maybe the two of you would like to say something as well.
Yes, just thank you to also all the students who came and helped out and worked with us and talked to us, and all of you for coming, and Gianfranco especially. So thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you.